My daughter said I was selfish for using our money on myself after they used me like a maid for decades. I gave her an answer she deserved. My name is Jenna. I'm 58 years old, living in a small Midwestern town where everybody knows each other's business, yet nobody really knows what happens behind closed doors. My story isn't unique, but it's mine, and after decades of silence, I'm finally ready to tell it. I grew up with just my mother, who worked 12-hour shifts at the local diner to put food on our table. She'd come home with swollen feet and the smell of grease clinging to her hair, but she never complained. "Education is your ticket out," she'd tell me, rubbing cream into her cracked hands. I took those words to heart, becoming a top student in the state, earning test scores that could have taken me anywhere. Then I met Rick when I was 19. He was everything I wasn't supposed to have: a college boy from a middle-class family with pressed shirts and a car that didn't break down every other week. In our small town, where girls like me were expected to follow in our mother's footsteps, Rick was my impossible dream. One night changed everything. I was walking home from my late shift when a group of men started following me, making crude comments. When one grabbed my arm, I fought back, slapped him hard enough to leave a mark. The next day, rumors spread that I was violent and trouble. But Rick stood up for me. He walked into the crowded cafe where everyone was whispering and handed me a handwritten letter defending my honor for all to see. In that moment, he was my knight, silencing an entire town of judgmental voices. We married when I was 21. I gave up my full scholarship to State University, the one my mother had cried over when the letter arrived. "It's okay," I told her. "Love is worth more than a degree." I believed that then. The early years were sweet. Rick would cup my face in his hands and say, "No one takes care of my mother like you do, Jenna." His mother, Lorraine, lived with us, a stern woman who measured her words carefully but seemed to approve of me. I gave birth to Kyle first, then Zoe 2 years later. We were the picture of domestic harmony until Lorraine suffered a stroke when Kyle was 5. She became bedridden, unable to speak, move, or care for herself. And Rick, with his perfect smile and perfect excuses, said, "I'm a man. It's not appropriate for me to bathe her or change her. You understand, right?" Just like that, my life contract was rewritten without my consent. For 16 years, I woke at 5 a.m. to the same routine: cleaning, Lorraine changing her sheets, washing soiled linens, preparing breakfast for everyone. I haven't had a full night's sleep in almost 2 decades because I had to turn Lorraine every 3 hours to prevent bed sores. While I managed this one-woman care facility, Rick traveled for work, conveniently absent during every holiday and school event. He'd return with cheap trinkets, a drugstore scarf, dried flowers, a broken seashell, saying, "These will last forever, just like my love for you." Meanwhile, Kyle and Zoe grew up watching me fade into the background of our home. To them, I wasn't a person with dreams or feelings. I was the household system, as expected and unremarkable as running water or electricity. Once I suggested taking a family photo for Thanksgiving, Rick laughed. "Who even takes family photos anymore? So corny." Later, I gathered all our old pictures and realized something I'd never noticed before. They were all of Rick with the kids. I existed only behind the camera, never in front of it. After 16 years of round-the-clock care, Lorraine passed away peacefully in her sleep. No bed sores, no infections, no injuries, because I had tended to her with a dedication her own son never showed. I didn't cry at the funeral. I just felt hollow, like an actor after the final curtain falls with no applause. A week later, Rick made an announcement at dinner. We should take a family trip, get away from everything. For the first time in 30 years, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe now, finally, he saw me. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing everything: printing tickets, packing bags, organizing medications, checking GPS routes. The morning of departure, I waited by the door with my small suitcase and a bag of snacks I'd prepared for everyone. Rick walked past me, car keys jingling in his hand. "There's no room for you," he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Next time." Kyle glanced at me, then quickly away. "Mom's getting old anyway. She'd just complain about being tired the whole time." Zoe said nothing, just walked straight to the car and closed the door with a decisive click. I stood on our porch holding a bag of carefully selected snacks that no one would eat, watching them pull away. The dust from the driveway hadn't even settled when my phone buzzed. It was a social media notification. Rick had posted a family vacation photo. There was Kyle, Zoe, Rick, and Clara, Rick's college friend, who had almost been his girlfriend before he met me. They were smiling at some scenic overlook, the sun catching on Clara's expensive sunglasses, her manicured hand resting casually on my husband's shoulder. That's when I knew this wasn't the first time they'd gone away without me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it must be some kind of misunderstanding. Clara just happened to be where they were vacationing. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe it was a coincidence. But as I scrolled through more photos, my hands trembling, I saw Clara sitting between Kyle and Rick at a restaurant, laughing with her head thrown back, wearing a designer jacket that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. My son, my Kyle, had his arm casually draped over her chair. They looked comfortable together, familiar. In another photo, Clara was wearing a Louis Vuitton scarf, identical to the one Zoe had proudly shown me last Christmas, claiming her boyfriend had bought it for her. I remembered how my daughter's eyes had lit up, how she'd treated that scarf like a precious artifact while the drugstore scarves Rick gave me collected dust in my drawer. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Not just from my husband, but from my own children. They'd created a parallel life that excluded me entirely. With shaking hands, I pulled out the small memory box I kept hidden under our bed. Inside were all the precious gifts Rick had given me over the years: a cheap scarf with fraying edges, dried flowers that had lost their color, a cracked seashell, a tiny ceramic figurine with a chipped ear. Fresh flowers wilt. Rick had told me once when I mentioned how a colleague's husband had surprised her with roses. "Dried ones last forever, just like my love for you." I'd believed him then, taking comfort in his practical, enduring love. But there, in one of the photos, was Clara holding a bouquet of fresh red roses. Rick's hand was on her lower back. Her smile was like a slap across the face of the past I had trusted in. I dug deeper into social media that night, following one breadcrumb to the next. Clara wasn't some chance encounter on this vacation. Photo after photo revealed the truth. She had been traveling with my family for years. Beaches, ski slopes, city lights, countryside retreats. Every 3 or 4 months like clockwork, while I stayed home to care for Lorraine or rest because I was too tired. They'd been creating memories without me. Rick had hidden these posts from me on his main account, but in his carelessness, he'd forgotten about a secondary account I'd created years ago to keep up with Kyle's high school activities, an account he didn't know existed. I scrolled through the digital evidence of my erasure until my eyes burned, each photo a knife to my heart. Rick, who had insisted that family photos are so old-fashioned, had dozens with Clara and our children. Smiling, candid, posed everything he'd refused to do with me. In one particularly painful image, Kyle was hugging Clara, his eyes closed in genuine affection. The caption read, "With the most amazing woman I know." My son had written those words about her, not me, not the woman who had checked his homework every night, who had held cold compresses to his forehead during fevers, who had worked 3 extra shifts to buy him the basketball shoes he needed. What I felt wasn't jealousy. It was rage. Pure, molten rage at being erased from my own family. The family I had built with my sacrifice, my time, my love. As midnight approached, I found myself standing before the bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in years. My hands were rough and cracked, from years of washing clothes by hand to save money for Rick's business suits and the kids' extracurriculars. My nails were broken and uneven from cleaning and scrubbing without rest. My phone screen lit up with one final photo: Clara and Rick, standing at the foot of the Golden Gate Bridge, his hand resting on her shoulder in the exact same way he used to touch me when we first met. They looked like they belonged together, like I had never existed. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, blood rushing to my head in waves of fury. If they had written me out of their story so completely, so callously, then it was time I wrote my own version. And this one wouldn't end with me fading quietly into the background. No, this time I would be the main character. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I picked up my phone and called Rick. My hands were steady now, my voice carefully controlled, as I listened to the phone ring 10, 11 times before he finally answered. "Make it quick," he said coldly. "I'm busy." I took a deep breath. Why wasn't there room for me in the car, but there was room for Clara? The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. I could almost see him scrambling for an explanation, his mind racing to construct a believable lie. She happened to be going the same way. He stammered. "Helped us book the hotel rooms. What, are you jealous?" The way he said it, like I was being unreasonable, like I was the problem, ignited something in me that had been smoldering for decades. "Are you sure the hotel only had beds for our children?" I asked, the bitterness rising in my throat like bile. "Or did Clara have her own bed? Maybe she even helped you with your pajamas while she was at it." "Don't talk nonsense," Rick snapped. "You're degrading yourself, Jenna." Degrading myself. After 30 years of silent servitude, he had the audacity to say I was degrading myself by questioning his betrayal. I hung up without another word. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Not Rick calling back to apologize or explain, but a text from Kyle. "My new computer arrives tomorrow. Remember to bring it up to my room. Be careful, it's expensive." A minute later, another message. "You're still healthy. Right. Carrying a computer upstairs shouldn't be a problem for you. Right." I stared at my cracked fingernails, at the calluses on my palms from decades of hand-washing clothes, to save money at the slight bend in my index finger from the time I'd jammed it. Moving Lorraine's hospital bed and couldn't afford to see a doctor because Kyle needed braces. The insult cut to my core. When had I become nothing but a servant in my own home? I thought back to our early days when I'd saved every penny from my waitressing job to buy Rick decent shoes and shirts so he could look the part of a successful college graduate. I remembered staying up until 3 a.m. to hand sew his first interview suit because we couldn't afford a tailor. And when Rick earned his first real paycheck, he brought me a plastic flower and said, "I need to save money. We have bigger things to worry about." Bigger things. Always. Bigger things. Never me. While I was riding crowded budget buses wedged between strangers whose bodies pressed against mine in the cramped space. Clara was flying business class. Photos showed her lounging in airport lounges, sipping champagne with my husband and children. I had refused to buy new winter boots for myself 3 years ago because Kyle needed textbooks. My coat was lined with an old blanket for extra warmth. Meanwhile, Clara wore cashmere coats in family photos with my children smiling like she belonged there. Something broke inside me that morning. I walked to the storage shed where Rick kept his fishing gear, his precious books, his old college papers, things he valued more than he ever valued me. I ran my fingers along his prized fishing rod, remembering how he once told me, "This is the only thing I always keep clean." Not our marriage, not his promises. A fishing rod. I snapped it in two with a single decisive motion. The crack echoed through the empty shed like the sound of liberation, but I didn't stop there. I walked into Rick's study and stared at his bookshelf filled with first editions, signed copies, leather-bound journals, hundreds of books he treasured more than he treasured his wife. I pulled out my old suitcase and began filling it, one book at a time. I wasn't going to burn them or destroy them out of spite. No, I had a better plan. These books would never be his again, and soon enough, neither would I. As I packed the books, memories flooded through me not of our happy marriage, but of all the times I'd been silenced, overlooked, pushed aside, of the cold dinners I'd eaten alone while Rick was working late, of the parent-teacher conferences I'd attended solo because he had important meetings, of the birthdays when he'd forgotten to even buy a card. Each book I packed was 30 years of rage finally finding its target. Each leather spine represented a promise, broken, a sacrifice unacknowledged, a piece of myself I'd given away and never gotten back. These books were his most prized possessions, and now they would help me reclaim my life. I folded each book, each notebook, each signed novel Rick had collected over the years into my sister's old leather suitcase, the one I'd used for her wedding 20 years ago. I didn't bother wiping away the dust that had gathered on some of the volumes. Let the marks of time remain, just like the true face behind his perfect mask had finally revealed itself to me. Some of the books bore my fingerprints, evidence of the times I'd carefully washed their plastic covers, believing I was preserving something precious out of love. What a fool I'd been tending to these objects while my own soul collected dust in the corner. The next morning, I dragged the heavy suitcase downtown to the city library, where Sam, my old friend from high school, worked as the head librarian. We'd lost touch over the years, another casualty of my isolated marriage, but I remembered he was still there, surrounded by the books he loved. When I pushed through the library doors, pulling that weathered suitcase, Sam looked up from the circulation desk, his reading glasses sliding down his nose in surprise. "Jenna, is that you?" He came around the counter, eyes darting between my face and the bulging suitcase. "Haven't seen you in years. What's all this?" I unzipped the suitcase right there in the middle of the library floor. Sam's eyes widened as he caught sight of the books inside. "Good Lord, Jenna," he whispered gingerly, lifting a first edition Hemingway. "These are rare, valuable. That's a signed Steinbeck, and is that—" He pulled out a leather-bound journal. "These are collector's items. Are you sure about this?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm not burning them if that's what you're asking, but he doesn't deserve them either. Here at least they'll be appreciated for what they are not, what they represent." Sam studied my face, understanding slowly dawning in his kind eyes. We'd never been more than friends, but there had been a time before Rick when I thought maybe we could have been something else. Another road not taken. "Would you like to be listed as the donor?" he asked gently. "This is quite a collection. The library board would probably want to acknowledge such a significant gift." I paused, considering, no, just listed as donated by a forgotten wife. Sam didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally nodded, there was respect in his eyes I hadn't seen directed at me in decades. Walking back home, I felt pounds lighter. My hands were empty for the first time in 30 years. I wasn't carrying responsibility, food, medicine, extra clothes, or someone else's expectations. The sensation was so foreign, I kept checking to make sure I hadn't forgotten something important. But the only important thing now was me. At home, I opened my laptop and searched for train tickets to Chicago one way. No return trip necessary. I wasn't sure what I'd find there, but I knew what I was leaving behind. For the first time, I packed a suitcase containing only my own clothes, no medications for others, no adult diapers for Lorraine, no snacks for Kyle's midnight cravings, just my things. Simple clothes that had seen better days, but they were mine. I printed the train ticket and booked a hotel, not the cheap motel we'd always stayed at on family trips, because we need to be practical with money, but a decent three-star place downtown. Not extravagant, but a world away from what I'd allowed myself. I even made an appointment at a salon, my first in over 10 years. I wouldn't dye my gray hair. I'd earned every silver strand, but I would have it cut properly, styled with dignity, instead of the hasty trims I'd given myself for years. The night before my departure, my phone rang. Rick's name flashed on the screen. I answered without emotion. "Why are my books out of order?" He demanded, not bothering with a greeting. "Did you touch my shelves?" I almost laughed at his obliviousness. He hadn't even noticed they were gone, just that something was different. "You should ask yourself that question," I replied evenly. "Before the books leave this house entirely." He didn't understand, couldn't comprehend that I would ever touch his precious collection. "Don't mess with my stuff," he barked before hanging up. I checked my suitcase one last time that night. Train ticket, coat, wallet, phone, everything ready. In the morning, I would leave this house. But they didn't know I had already begun dismantling the world they had used to imprison me all these years. As I laid in bed that final night, I thought about the woman I once was. The bright student with scholarship offers the young woman full of hope, and the woman I would become tomorrow. The years between felt like a long, dark tunnel I was finally emerging from, blinking in the harsh but welcome light of day. Tomorrow would be the first day of my life. My real life. The train was scheduled to depart at 7:30 a.m. I arrived at the station an hour early, clutching my ticket like it might dissolve in my hand. I'd never traveled anywhere alone before. Not really. Family trips had always been choreographed around everyone else's needs, with me serving as the coordinator, the packer, the walking first aid kit. My breath came quick and shallow, my palms damp with sweat. Not from fear, but from a bubbling excitement I hadn't felt in decades. I felt like that 20-year-old girl again, heading to her first job interview, heart hammering with possibility. I chose a window seat, settling in as other passengers filed past. When the train finally lurched forward, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching my small town shrink away. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting my reflection back at me, a woman aged by years of service, but with something resilient still burning in her eyes. 2 hours into the journey, I ventured to the dining car and ordered a $5 coffee and a grilled cheese sandwich. Such a simple thing, buying food for myself without calculating how it would impact the family budget, without wondering if someone at home might need that $5 more than I did. The coffee was rich and fragrant, the sandwich warm and golden. For the first time in recent memory, I wasn't just eating to keep my body functioning. I was tasting life itself. Across the aisle, an elderly couple held hands over their small table. They shared a peppermint candy, breaking it in half with matching smiles. Something twisted in my chest as I watched them. How long had I lived without experiencing that simple joy of partnership, of being treated as an equal, worthy of affection, even after decades together? My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Are you using Dad's credit card? That money was supposed to fix up my apartment." Before I could respond, another message appeared. "I'm not asking for much, just some help with painting costs. Are you planning to take it all?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For 30 years, I'd apologized, justified, explained myself. "Not today. The card has both your father's and my name on it." I typed, "And I'm still alive. Remember that." Her response came quickly. "You're spending too much money. Don't be selfish, Mom." Selfish. After 3 decades of self-sacrifice, my daughter had the audacity to call me selfish for spending a few $100s on myself. The truth hit me like a physical blow in their eyes. I wasn't a person. I was a bank account, a resource to be depleted. In 30 years, I'd never bought anything just for me. I'd sewn up torn bras with needle and thread, while Zoe changed designer handbags with the seasons. Rick dined at French restaurants with clients, and apparently Clara while I skipped breakfast to buy vitamins for his mother. By the time the train pulled into Union Station, I felt like I'd traveled much further than the 200 miles from our small town to Chicago. I'd crossed a boundary inside myself that I could never uncross. The hotel I'd chosen was modest by most standards, a three-star place downtown, clean and comfortable, but hardly luxurious. To me, it might as well have been the Ritz. "Welcome, Mrs. Winters," the receptionist said cheerfully, handing me an actual key, not an electronic card. "Enjoy your stay with us." My room was on the 5th floor. When I opened the door, I nearly gasped. A pristine white bed dominated the space. Soft yellow lamps cast a gentle glow, and the air smelled of lavender essential oil. No groaning from Lorraine's room. No Rick complaining about dinner being too salty. No constant demands. Just quiet. Beautiful. Complete quiet. I ran my hand over the crisp duvet. "This hotel is really nice." I told the bellhop who'd helped with my small bag. He smiled. "Ma'am, this is just a standard budget chain. The five-star places charge about 4 times what you're paying here." After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked up the hotel where Rick and Clara were staying on their current trip. One night, $1,800, I laughed a bitter sound that bounced off the walls of my empty room. For 30 years, I'd pinched every penny so we could all live comfortably. Meanwhile, they'd been living large on the very money I'd helped save, spending in 2 nights what I'd been allowed to spend on myself in a year. That afternoon, I walked to Millennium Park. The Bean reflected the city skyline, distorting visitors into funhouse versions of themselves. I asked a stranger to take my picture. Another first. I'd always been the one behind the camera, preserving memories for everyone else. In the photo, I stood alone, no one by my side. But I was smiling, and for the first time in 30 years, the smile reached my eyes. As I was walking back to my hotel, my phone vibrated. Rick's name flashed on the screen. I answered, curious what had finally made him notice my absence. "Where the hell are you?" His voice was tight with anger. "The credit card company just flagged charges in Chicago." So it wasn't my absence he'd noticed. It was the money. "You spent nearly $800 in one day." Rick spat into the phone. "Who do you think you are?" I leaned against the hotel room window, watching Chicago's skyline glitter in the evening light. $786 to be exact. Train ticket, hotel room, meals. Still less than half the cost of one night at the hotel you're staying at with Clara. The silence stretched for 5 long seconds. I could almost feel his throat constricting, his mind racing to figure out how much I knew. "You're being selfish?" he finally managed. "You don't earn any money. Don't compare yourself to people who actually work." A laugh escaped me, sharp and genuine. "I don't earn money." What exactly had I been doing for the past 30 years? Providing round-the-clock nursing care, cooking, cleaning, raising children, managing our home, all labor that would have cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars if he'd had to pay market rates. I hung up without another word and turned off my notifications. I knew what was coming, a storm of texts, accusations, demands. But this time, I wouldn't be the dutiful wife rushing to smooth things over. Instead, I booked another night at the hotel. I wasn't finished with Chicago yet. I wasn't finished with freedom. The next day, I wandered the city streets, allowing myself to explore without a schedule or a list of errands. At a small pizza place, the young waitress brought me an extra slice. "On the house," she said with a smile. "You remind me of my mom. She travels alone too." On the L train, a teenage boy stood up and offered me his seat when the car got crowded. Such simple kindnesses, freely given with no expectation of repayment. In these brief interactions with strangers, I felt more seen, more human than I had in my own home for decades. I spent 4 days in Chicago before returning home. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back. I wanted to see how they would react when they thought I was no longer under their control. The house was surprisingly full when I walked in. Rick, Kyle, and Zoe were all in the living room laughing and talking with Clara sitting in the middle of them. My spot. She sat on my couch in my living room surrounded by my family as if she belonged there. Kyle looked up first. "Mom, we have a special guest. Clara came to visit." As if she were a distant relative or an old friend of the family, not the woman who had been systematically replacing me for years, Zoe barely acknowledged my presence, brushing past me toward the kitchen. "Did you not get the juice I texted you about?" she asked irritably, as if I'd just stepped out for groceries rather than been gone for days. Clara sat with her legs crossed, holding a teacup, my favorite teacup, as if she owned the place. Her designer purse rested on the coffee table I'd polished faithfully every week. "Rick asked me to help with some hotel bookings," Clara said smoothly, her hand on Rick's shoulder. "I didn't mean to intrude." Rick placed his arm around her shoulders, looking at me as if I were a tenant who'd unexpectedly returned early from vacation. "Clara's been a huge help with organizing our trips," he added, not a trace of shame in his voice. I stood still observing this invasion of my territory. 30 years I'd spent building this home, and in just a few days they'd installed my replacement as if I'd never existed. "So," I said, finally, my voice steadier than I felt, "how many years have you all been enjoying steak dinners together? Getting tired of them yet?" A tense silence fell over the room. Kyle stared at me. "Mom, what are you talking about?" The smile that spread across my face felt cold and unfamiliar. "If you're going to replace me, you could at least come up with a better reason than 'there wasn't enough room in the car.'" Without waiting for a response, I walked to the drawer in the entryway table, the one where I kept important papers and mementos. I pulled out a stack of photos I'd printed in Chicago. Photos I'd downloaded from Clara's public social media accounts from friends of friends who hadn't locked down their privacy settings tightly enough. Photos spanning 3 years of trips, beach vacations, ski weekends, city tours, all featuring Rick, Clara, Kyle, and Zoe. Together, smiling family portraits that didn't include me. I tossed them onto the coffee table, watching as they scattered like playing cards in a game I was finally ready to win. 3 years of no room in the car, I said quietly. 3 years of, "You should stay home and rest." 3 years of me believing I wasn't wanted when the truth was, I wasn't needed. The color drained from Rick's face. Kyle's mouth opened and closed without forming words. Zoe froze in the kitchen doorway. Clara's perfectly manicured hand tightened around my teacup. The silence in the room was absolute, as if even the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. After I threw the photos onto the coffee table, the room went silent. Time seemed to freeze as my family, if I could still call them, that stared at the evidence of their betrayal scattered before them. Kyle picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It showed him and Clara building a sandcastle on a beach I'd never visited. In another, they were all on a ski slope, Clara's arm linked through Rick's snowflakes catching in their hair. Vacation after vacation, holiday after holiday, all moments I'd been told I wasn't needed for. Zoe recovered first, her voice trying for casual but missing by a mile. "Maybe she just happened to run into us a lot. It's not that weird." Rick snorted, attempting to regain control of the situation with dismissal. "You're making a big deal out of some photos. Women always so dramatic about nothing." Clara leaned forward, her voice honey-sweet with concern. "Jenna, you're confused. If there was something between Rick and me, why would he have married you?" The question hung in the air, meant to remind me of my place, to make me doubt myself. But I was done doubting. "Do you remember your college entrance exams?" "Clara," I asked quietly. "I ranked in the top percentile of the state. You were 40 places below me. I turned to Rick. Who sewed your first interview suit? Who bought the shoes you wore to apply for your first real job? Their faces blurred before me as decades of suppressed truth poured out. Who stayed up until dawn mending the shirt you tore at the company party? Who spoon-fed your mother for 16 years when she couldn't lift her own hand? No one answered. No one could. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope I'd picked up in Chicago. Divorce papers already completed with my information. I'd consulted with a lawyer there, wanting to be prepared. I'm filing for divorce, I said, placing the papers on top of the scattered photos. Rick's face contorted from shock to contempt in seconds. He laughed, a harsh sound that might have wounded me once. You think I'll give you anything? You have no job, no skills, no value. I'll offer $15,000, and that's being generous. I met his gaze steadily. If I have no value, then how have you lived more than half your life on my labor? His face darkened. He grabbed the divorce papers and tore them in half, then quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. I'm not signing anything. You have no right. I smiled, feeling strangely calm. No signature. Then we'll let the courts decide. I walked out of the house that had been my prison for 30 years straight, to a different lawyer's office in town. I filed for divorce that afternoon, requesting an equitable division of assets under state law, which entitled me to half of everything we'd built together, but I wasn't finished. The next day, I created a large poster board covered with photos and a detailed timeline of Rick's deception. I stood outside his corporate headquarters during lunch hour holding it high. The headline read, "Model husband, unfaithful partner, living off his wife's labor." Employees gathered, whispering and pointing. Some took photos with their phones. Rick's carefully cultivated image as the devoted family man crumbled before his colleagues' eyes. By evening, his company's HR department had received 3 calls questioning his character. 3 days later, my phone rang. Kyle's voice was frantic. "Mom, Dad had a stroke. He went into his study this morning and found his books missing. He collapsed right there." I sat on a park bench watching ducks glide across the pond. "Tell your father to check the public library. Mom, those books were his life." I closed my eyes, feeling the sun on my face. And I was the one who carried that life for him. Rick recovered physically, but something had broken inside him. Clara stayed by his side in the rehabilitation facility for 1 month before disappearing without a goodbye. When faced with the reality of actually caring for someone instead of being cared for, she chose the easier path. Just as Rick had done his entire life, Zoe and Kyle began avoiding their father. They had their own lives and didn't want to be dragged into the increasingly ugly legal battle. Rick's lawyers tried every delay tactic, every intimidation strategy. He hid assets, claimed poverty, even suggested I was mentally unstable. But I had documentation for everything, every unpaid hour of caregiving, every sacrificed opportunity, every joint account he'd drained for vacations with Clara. Nearly a year after I'd stood in that Chicago hotel room and answered Rick's angry call about credit card charges, the judge issued his ruling, a 50-50 split of all marital assets, with Rick responsible for legal fees due to his deliberate delays and dishonest financial disclosures. I walked out of the courthouse with my head high, my hands steady, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth. For the first time in decades, I had been seen. My work had been valued, my sacrifice acknowledged. As I descended the courthouse steps, my phone vibrated with a text message from Zoe. I expected more accusations, more demands. Instead, I found something I hadn't seen in years, a question that wasn't about what I could do for her. "Would you want to come stay with me for a while, just to talk?" I stood there, sunlight warming my shoulders, the weight of 30 years finally lifting. My daughter wanted to know me not as a servant, not as a resource, but as a person. I typed my reply carefully. "Yes, but this time I'm bringing my own suitcase." I didn't go back to Zoe's place right away. First, I needed to find my own. With my share of the settlement, I moved to a small coastal town 3 hours from where I'd spent the last 3 decades. I rented a bright apartment in an upscale senior community, not because I considered myself old at 58, but because I wanted the peace such places offered. Instead of waking to the smell of antiseptic and the sight of bed sores that needed tending, my mornings now began with the aroma of fresh coffee, the sound of waves and sunlight streaming through windows I could leave open all night if I wanted. No one to wake me at odd hours. No one's needs to place before my own. In the community center, I joined a knitting circle. My fingers, once cracked and rough from constant cleaning, grew nimble again as I learned to create instead of merely maintain. I took up embroidery and mending skills I'd once used only for practical purposes. Now becoming art in my hands, I repaired garments for other residents, asking nothing in return but the genuine smiles they gave me. "You have healing hands," Mrs. Peterson told me one afternoon as I fixed the torn sleeve of her late husband's cardigan that she still wore on cold days. I just smiled. I only stitch back together what people think they've thrown away. 6 months into my new life, I rented a small booth at the weekend farmers market. A simple sign hung above it, "Memory Repair." People brought me their damaged keepsakes, wedding dresses with torn hems, children's teddy bears, missing eyes, quilts coming apart at the seams. Things most would discard. I made whole again. It wasn't wealth I sought. I had enough money to live comfortably now. What I wanted was purpose on my own terms, connection that didn't drain me dry. One Sunday afternoon, my phone rang with Zoe's number. I almost didn't answer, still protective of my newfound peace, but something made me pick up. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to understand." I didn't respond with the flood of grievances I once might have. Instead, I told her a single memory when she was 9 and had the flu. The rest of the family still went on their planned weekend trip. I stayed behind to care for her, holding her hair back when she vomited, cooling her fever through the night. When they returned, no one asked how either of us had fared. No one thanked me. "I'm not angry anymore, Zoe," I said. After finishing the story, "I'm just not there to sacrifice myself anymore." The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she whispered, "I get it now. I think I always did." 2 months later, I received word that Rick had suffered another stroke. This one left him unable to speak or care for himself. Ironically, much like his mother had been, Kyle had placed him in a nursing facility, unable or unwilling to provide the care I once had. I wrote a short note and asked the facility's staff to read it to him. "Rick, if you ever thought I was an object, that object has become a person, and people don't go back to being things." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. In early spring, Zoe came to visit. She brought a homemade cake, lopsided and unevenly frosted, evidence she'd made it herself, rather than buying the perfect bakery confections she once insisted upon. I took a bite and nodded. "Not bad. Better than a lot of things I used to make." We sat in silence on my small balcony overlooking the ocean, watching waves crash against the shore just as life had once crashed against me, before finally receding, leaving me scoured but still standing. During my second summer by the sea, the knitting circle expanded to include some younger women from town. One afternoon, Elaine, a new widow in her 70s, asked me the question I'd been expecting. Someone would eventually ask, "If you could go back 30 years, would you choose Rick again?" The group grew quiet, needles pausing mid-stitch. I looked out toward the horizon, considering. "No," I said, finally feeling the truth of it resonate through me. "But I would choose myself stronger, braver, and much sooner." The women nodded in understanding. No judgment, no pity, just recognition of a journey they could all in some way relate to. Now, as I sit on this wooden bench near the pier wrapped in a cardigan, I knitted myself sipping coffee. I didn't have to justify buying. I watched the sunset turn the ocean into molten gold. My hair is fully silver now, and I wear it proudly, no longer hiding the evidence of time's passage. A little girl runs past her teddy bear slipping from her grasp. I bend down my knees, creaking in protest, and retrieve it before the wind can carry it away. "Thank you, ma'am," she calls out, clutching the bear to her chest. I smile, my eyes never leaving the horizon. No, thank you for reminding me that I'm still here. Because that's the truth that Rick, Clara, and even my own children failed to understand. I was always there, a person, not a function. A woman with dreams. Not just hands that worked. A heart that felt, not just a body that served. I lived 30 years as if I were invisible. Now, even when I'm alone, I see myself clearly. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I take another sip of my coffee, savoring the bitterness and sweetness in equal measure. Like life itself, it contains both. And finally, I'm free to taste it all.